All right, so previously we looked at holistic ethics, which included this notion of deep ecology and Leopold's land ethics, which really kind of shifted our focus, morally speaking, from individuals to the larger ecological community, the natural world at large, right? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to turn to a different, yet still very related approach, which is called ecofeminism. Now, ecofeminism emerged in the 1970s and 80s at the same time that feminism itself was kind of emerging. So it's both understood as a philosophical perspective as well as a social movement in general. It really kind of highlights the deep connections between the sort of domination of nature and also the domination of women. Right. So in doing so, it's arguing that the same sort of cultural patterns and structures that justified oppressing women also justifies exploiting the natural world. So there's a really fascinating and I think important connection that's being made here. Now, what are the roots of ecofeminism? The term itself, ecofeminism, emerged around 1974, but it actually does go back even further than that. Ecofeminists make a very interesting point. They try to show how long-standing traditions in Western society tend to associate women with nature and men with reason and rationality. So this idea is that nature is often portrayed as something wild and chaotic, something that needs to be tamed, something that needs to be controlled. In the same sort of way that oftentimes in patriarchal traditions, we get women that are being portrayed as being in need of being controlled, in need of being tamed. Men, on the other hand, traditionally in Western society, have been linked with reason and rationality, with placing logic and order to an unstructured world, with culture and sophistication, supposedly living in this kind of civilized world, where men's job is to tame women and to tame nature itself. So while this is certainly symbolic, I think the symbolic connection has a lot of justification insofar as there have been these ways of exploiting both the natural world and the subordination of women to men. And ecofeminism argues that these oppressions are not accidental. It's not just a mere coincidence. Rather, they're happening along parallel lines. So in an important way, they're essentially linked or structurally connected in that regard. So then what's the basic claim being made here? I think the core claim at the center of ecofeminism is that the logic of domination is the same in both cases, the domination of women and the domination of nature. The worldview that says nature exists to serve humans' ends is connected to the same worldview that says women exist to serve men's ends. So if we want to overcome the kind of environmental destruction that we've been pointing out so far in this week's module, then we need to address not only our relationship to nature, but also to the patriarchal and colonial systems that give power that allows us to sustain that relationship. So really, deep down, ecofeminism should be understood as a social and political critique. It's not merely an environmental ethic. It situates environmental problems in this broader context of power, oppression, and justice. Of course, there's going to be different strands of ecofeminism. It's not a single theory. Instead, we should really think of it as a kind of a group of theories that have a kind of family resemblance, different perspectives that are related in various different important ways. So I think a couple important strands should include cultural ecofeminism, where we are emphasizing women's unique connection to nature, often through roles of caregiving, reproduction, and embodied knowledge. And there are also different cultural ecofeminists who do, in fact, celebrate traditional values like being feminine or values like the care that we experience between a mother and a child, that kind of nurturing the relationship between a mother and a child. And this kind of relationality that we can see as a sort of alternative perspective to the destructive logic that so commonly is associated with domination. But then there's other perspectives as well There's social materialist ecofeminists, and these views focus more on social structures rather than the sort of symbolic connections that we find in society. These views tend to highlight how systems like patriarchal and capitalistic, perhaps colonialistic views exploit both women and nature in these sorts of ways that are parallel to one another. And they treat both as resources to be extracted and controlled, right? So we can see how that's a kind of social materialist view. And then there's also spiritual views of ecofeminism. These spiritual views kind of draw on different goddesses and the traditions that we see in indigenous spirituality, different earth-centered religions that attempt to reimagine our relationship with the natural world. These views often argue that spiritual reconnections is actually essential for the healing that's needed, both ecologically speaking, as well as the social oppression that occurs in society between men and women. So there's not like a single strand of ecofeminism. There's a lot of different perspectives or ways that we can approach this. Now, just as we saw previously, there are critiques of ecofeminism as well. So, for instance, even though it's been highly influential, many critics have argued that some versions, especially these kind of cultural and spiritual forms of ecofeminism, these views seem to risk essentializing women, which also seems to reinforce various stereotypes that women are closer to nature than men. In fact, ecofeminists themselves have debated how to avoid this kind of pitfall. Many argue that the point is not that women are naturally closer to nature, but that patriarchal societies have historically forced women into these roles. So these kinds of connections to nature might in some sense be arbitrary. And that sort of recognition, I think, is important. It's important to recognize that history is playing a role in essentializing these sorts of views of women. Still, there's other critics who have argued that ecofeminism is too Western in some ways, or maybe in some sense too middle class, or not sufficiently attentive to things like race and global inequalities. And in response, more recently, ecofeminists have actually emphasized things like intersectionality and connecting ecological issues that, with aspects of race, with aspects of class, and indeed colonialism. But again, I think that it's important to recognize that it's not merely some philosophical view, right? It's not just a view about ethics, but it is in fact a social view. And that means that there's a lot of sort of ways to understand ecofeminism in practice, right? It's not merely a theoretical approach to these issues. In fact, it's actually been tied to various activist movements, socially speaking, all across the world. Now, how exactly are we to understand ecofeminism as it relates to holistic ethics? How does ecofeminism connect back to the sort of ecocentrism and holistic ethics that we were considering previously? Notice that both emphasize community and relationality. However, ecofeminism adds an important dimension to all this. It warns us not to ignore the power structures that are shaping our relationships, that are shaping the relationship between each other and with nature. For example, remember that Leopold's land ethic is essentially calling us to see ourselves as members of a larger ecological community. And that's important. But ecofeminists, they want to ask, well, whose voices is it that's being heard? Whose voices actually are we listening to in this community? Whose interests are being served? So I think there's some interesting ways in which we can actually combine and connect variations of ecofeminism with ecocentrism and holistic ethics. Ecofeminism is a way that we can kind of ensure that environmental ethics does not become a stale, abstract philosophy that essentially just detaches us from the lived realities of oppression and inequality. Instead, it's a social movement. It's something that is actively asking us to engage with our communities, to engage with the social practices in order to reimagine our relationship with the larger community. So thinking about how something like ecofeminism is related to Leopold's land ethic or to holistic ethics more generally, that's going to help us explore, different ways in which environmental ethics actually connects to agricultural ethics. And given that agriculture is one of the clearest places where human domination of nature and the systems of social inequality actually do come together, then questions about stewardship, food systems, and our obligations to future generations will actually be really important and help us to see how these ethical frameworks actually play together and support one another in practice rather than just in theory. So that's what we're going to turn to in the next video.